They came without warning, without mercy, without even the decency to announce their intentions. The alien vessels appeared in every major city's sky on a Tuesday morning in the year 2031. Not with weapons blazing, not with fire and destruction, but with something far more insidious. They came with truth. The Valthari, as they would later be called, had watched humanity for 300 years before arriving. They had catalogued every war, every famine, every self-inflicted wound humanity had ever suffered. They arrived not as conquerors of territory, but as conquerors of illusion. Their first broadcast overrode every communication system on Earth simultaneously. A calm, translated voice filled every television, every radio, every phone, every speaker on the planet. People of Earth, you have been living inside a manufactured comfort. That comfort ends today. The Valthari didn't drop bombs. They dropped data. Financial systems laid bare. Every corrupted government account, every backroom deal, every stolen resource, every hidden truth. Corporate records exposed, every suppressed medical cure, every buried environmental report, every lobbied law that cost lives. Religious institution files, military secret programs, intelligence agency, black budgets, all of it. Broadcast in every language. In 48 hours, humanity saw itself completely naked for the first time in its existence. The Valthari called it the sobering. Humans called it the collapse, because that is exactly what followed. Stock markets didn't just crash, they ceased to function entirely within 72 hours. Governments that had held power through carefully constructed lies found themselves paralyzed overnight. 3 sitting heads of state were removed by their own militaries before the first week ended. Riots broke out in 47 countries. Supply chains fractured. Banks froze. Internet infrastructure buckled under the weight of the exposed truth. The Valthari watched from their ships, hovering silently, making no move to help or hinder. They had delivered the sobering. What came next was humanity's problem. Their final broadcast was brief. You cannot build anything real on a foundation of lies. Rebuild or perish. Then their ships rose beyond the clouds and vanished. They didn't leave entirely. Humanity would later learn the Valthari had seeded orbital monitoring stations above every continent. They were watching. Always watching. Waiting to see if the species would survive its own awakening. In the first year after the sobering, 4 billion humans were food insecure. Infrastructure that had depended on corrupt systems of distribution simply stopped functioning. A full third of the world's medications became inaccessible as pharmaceutical supply chains collapsed under the weight of exposed fraud. 17 regional conflicts that had been artificially suppressed or prolonged by outside interference erupted into open warfare. The death toll in year 1 was 212 million people. Historians would later call it the Year of Glass, because everything that had once seemed solid became see-through and then shattered. Like this video and subscribe for more epic HFY stories. Share with every human who needs to hear this, but humans are not a species that lies down quietly. In the ruins of the old financial systems, something unexpected happened. Barter networks, already informal in many parts of the world, exploded into sophisticated trading ecosystems within months. Communities that had been divided by political manipulation found themselves facing the same raw problems and began cooperating. In Lagos, a former corrupt city administrator named Ade Okafor used her knowledge of the old systems to build the first post-sobering food distribution network. She knew every trick that had been used to steal resources. Now she used that knowledge to make sure nothing was stolen. Within 8 months, her network was feeding 11 million people and had been replicated in 6 other cities. In Mumbai, engineers who had previously worked for suppressed clean energy companies finally had permission to publish their research. The patents that had buried their work no longer had legal protection. TNT system had collapsed with the governments that enforced it. Within 2 years, open-source fusion microreactor blueprints were circulating freely across what remained of the internet. They weren't perfect. The first 50 exploded or failed, but the 51st worked, and the 52nd. And by the 10th year after the sobering, 300 functioning microreactors were powering communities across 6 continents. In Scandinavia, a loose coalition of former academics, engineers, and local farmers began drafting what they called the Honest Charter. Not a constitution in the old sense, not a document of power, a document of accountability, a framework where every decision made by any person in a leadership role had to be recorded, reasoned, and publicly accessible in real time. Deception wasn't criminalized. It was simply made structurally impossible. Every resource allocation, every vote, every policy, all of it logged to a distributed ledger that no single entity could alter or erase. The honest charter spread, not because anyone forced it, because it worked. Communities that adopted it resolved disputes faster, distributed resources more efficiently, and lost fewer people to the cascading failures that still plagued the regions clinging to old power structures. By year 15, 43 communities across 12 countries had adopted some version of the honest charter framework. They called themselves the Transparent Settlements, and they were the seeds of what would eventually become humanity's new civilization. But the road was still soaked in suffering. In year 18, the last of the old world nation-states that had tried to reassert centralized control through military force finally collapsed. The Eastern Bloc reconstitution, a desperate attempt by former Eurasian powers to rebuild authoritarian governance, ended in a catastrophic civil fracture. What followed was called the Long Scatter, a decade-long period of mass migration as millions of people moved away from failed states toward transparent settlements. The infrastructure couldn't handle it. The transparent settlements weren't ready. Winters in year 20 and 21 were brutal. Famine hit again. Disease swept through overcrowded transition camps. 40 million people died in those 2 years alone. And yet, not a single transparent settlement collapsed, because they had built their systems for honesty, not comfort. When resources ran short, the records showed exactly how short. No one could lie about the numbers. No one could redirect supplies to the well-connected. Every person in a transparent settlement died or survived based on the actual reality of what was available, not on the political weight of their family name. It was brutal. It was fair. And it held. If you're still watching, drop a comment below. Like and subscribe. This saga is just beginning. BRTRT, the world had reorganized itself into something no political theorist from the old world would have predicted. Not nations. Not empires. Not city-states in the classic sense. Mesh communities, interconnected settlements of between 5,000 and 200,000 people, linked by the distributed ledger networks and the open-source resource sharing protocols that had evolved from the early, honest charter framework. No central government. No global authority. A web of mutual agreements, each one recorded, each one none of them backed by anything except the shared interests of the communities involved. The Valthari monitoring stations observed all of this without comment. Occasionally, one of the stations would emit a brief signal, a single pulse, in a spectrum that humans had learned to detect. No one knew what it meant. Some thought it was calibration. Some thought it was acknowledgement. A small community of signal analysts in what had once been Chile became obsessed with decoding the pulses. They spent 11 years on the problem. They got nowhere, but in getting nowhere, they accidentally developed one of the most sophisticated signal processing systems humanity had ever built. It would matter later. Much later. The first generation born entirely after the sobering reached adulthood around year 20. They were different in ways their parents found both inspiring and unsettling. They had grown up in a world with no advertising, because the systems that had supported mass advertising had collapsed. They had grown up with no elected representatives, because the elections had broken down with the governments. They had grown up with transparent resource records and open-source education and community decision-making from the time they could participate. They didn't understand nostalgia for the old world, because they had never lived in it. They looked at the historical records, which were now fully intact and accessible, stripped of the propaganda layers that had once filtered them, and they saw the old world for what it had been. They weren't angry about it. They were simply resolved never to rebuild it. This generation, called the First Clear by later historians, became the architects of the mature, transparent settlement system. They standardized the mesh network protocols. They built the first inter-settlement judicial frameworks. They formalized the resource-sharing compacts. They did all of this without any of the old mechanisms of power. No courts backed by armies. No laws backed by prisons. Compliance was enforced by exclusion. Settlements that violated the compacts were disconnected from the mesh. And in a world where survival depended on the mesh, exclusion was the harshest punishment imaginable. It worked because the alternative was returning to the old world's silence and lies, and no one wanted that anymore. Year 50, the human population, which had fallen to 4.2 billion in the dark years, had stabilized and begun to grow again, slowly, carefully. Communities chose how many people they could sustainably support, and they stuck to those numbers, not because any authority told them to, because the resource records made the math obvious to everyone. The first real contact with the Valthari happened in year 63, and it came from the most unexpected direction. A 14-year-old girl named Sira Matthias, living in a mesh settlement in the former Swiss Alps, had been born with a rare neurological condition that gave her an extraordinary facility for pattern recognition. She had been studying the orbital monitoring station signals since she was 9. On a cold morning in March of year 63, she transmitted a response sequence to the nearest station. Not a greeting, not a question, a correction. The station had been transmitting a repeating mathematical sequence with a deliberate flaw in it, a test. It would turn out that the Valthari had been running for 63 years, waiting for someone to notice. Sira noticed, and she answered. Smash that like button, share this video, and subscribe. The Valthari are about to respond. The response from the station came within 6 hours. It was not a message. It was a torrent. 40 years of compressed linguistic and mathematical data, transmitted in a burst that overwhelmed every receiving station humanity had within range. It took 11 years to fully decode it. What they found inside changed everything. The Valthari had not simply watched humanity for 300 years before the sobering. They had watched humanity for 12,000 years. The data contained a complete record of human civilization, not from humanity's own flawed and fragmented history, but from external observation. Every rise and fall of every empire, every plague, every invention, every war, and something else. A pattern. Humanity had come close to this kind of civilizational collapse before. Not once. Not twice. 7 times over 12,000 years, human civilizations had reached a point of sufficient complexity that their internal corruption and unacknowledged truths threatened total collapse. 6 times, the collapse had happened anyway, resetting the clock by centuries. The sobering had been the Valthari's intervention in the 7th cycle. They had not done it out of charity. The data made that clear. The Valthari were members of a galactic network called the Accord, a loose coalition of spacefaring species that had agreed, over thousands of years, to a single foundational rule. No species could join the Accord, while still governed by systemic deception at a civilizational scale. The Valthari had intervened not to save humanity, but to determine whether humanity was capable of qualifying. The sobering had been an entrance exam, and the Accord had been watching the results for 63 years. This revelation hit the mesh communities like a second shockwave. Some settlements wanted nothing to do with alien politics. They had rebuilt their world with their own hands, and they owed no alien coalition anything. Some settlements saw it as validation proof that the direction humanity had chosen was recognized by the wider universe as the right one. Some settlements were simply terrified, because if the Accord was watching, and if there were criteria for membership, then there were also criteria for rejection, and no one knew what happened to species that failed the exam. The debate raged across the mesh for years. It was the first genuinely global human conversation in 60 years, and it happened the way all decisions happen now, transparently, with every argument logged. Every voice counted, every position publicly staked. In the end, humanity voted not as a single entity, but as thousands of individual settlements, each recording their decision to respond. The response was simple. We are still building. We ask for time. The Valthari replied within a week. You have been given time. 390 years remain in your assessment window. Continue. 390 years. The sobering had happened in 2031. The assessment window would close in 2500. Humanity had not yet reached year 70. There were 4 centuries left. The knowledge changed the texture of human ambition. Not urgently, not with the frantic energy of a deadline, with the steady, patient determination of a species that had already survived its own worst impulses, and knew now that survival was a craft, not a miracle. Like, subscribe, and share. This story is bigger than any of us, and it deserves to be heard. The next 100 years were the years of construction, not of monuments, not of weapons, of systems. Healthcare systems built on complete transparency of research, with no profit motive distorting what got studied, what got published, what got deployed. Within 80 years of the sobering, human life expectancy had risen to 97 years in transparent settlements. Not because of miraculous new discoveries, but because the old discoveries that had been suppressed or delayed by corporate interests were finally deployed freely. Educational systems that abandoned the model of information transmission and rebuilt themselves around the model of capacity development. Children in the post-sobering world weren't taught facts. They were taught how to evaluate claims, how to trace the source of information, how to recognize the shape of a lie even when you couldn't immediately name it. By year 100, the generation being educated in these systems was the most epistemically rigorous human population that had ever lived. They were also, by every metric, the mesh settlements could measure, the happiest, not because life was easy. Life was still hard. Resources were still finite. People still suffered and died and grieved, but the suffering was real suffering, not the manufactured suffering of a system designed to keep people afraid and compliant. There is a difference between hard and cruel. The new world was hard. The old world had been cruel. By year 150, humanity had begun to look outward again. The open-source fusion reactor technology, refined over 12 decades, had reached a level of efficiency that made space travel economically feasible for the first time without requiring the old world's nation-state military budgets to back it. The first post-sobering spacecraft was not a government project. It was a mesh compact, 230 settlements, pooling resources toward a common goal, each one's contribution and each one's expected benefit logged transparently on the ledger. The ship was called the Clear Horizon, and it launched from a facility in the Atacama Desert on a morning that 3 billion humans watched through the Mesh's broadcast network. No single nation's flag was painted on its hull. A single symbol, an open eye, the unofficial emblem of the transparent settlement movement. The Clear Horizon reached Mars in 4 months. What it found there was not what anyone expected. The Valkyrie had been busy, not in Mars itself, but in Mars orbit. A structure, clearly artificial, clearly not human, had been placed in a stable orbit around the planet. It was not a station, not a weapon, not a vessel. It was a library. The structure contained, in formats that took humanity's best signal analysts, including, now elderly but still working, Sedamatiest, 3 years to decode the complete accumulated knowledge of 11 species that had attempted to join the Accord and failed. Their histories, their sciences, their philosophies, their mistakes. The Valtari had left it there as a gift, or a warning, or both. 11 species. 11 failures. Different reasons, different circumstances. But in the library's own careful cross-referenced analysis, a single thread running through all of them. Every failed species had reached a critical juncture where they could have chosen systemic honesty and didn't. Not because they were evil, because honesty was hard, and deception was easy. And in the short term, the easy path always looked like the right one. All 11 had chosen the easy path. None of them existed anymore. Subscribe if this is making your soul vibrate, like and share, because humanity deserves this story. The Library of 11, as it was called, became the most studied collection of knowledge in human history. For 200 years, scholars, engineers, philosophers, and children on school excursions pored over its contents. It changed human culture in ways that were subtle at first, and then profound. The 11 failed species had all, in their own ways, been brilliant, scientifically advanced, culturally rich. None of that had saved them. What had saved humanity, at least so far, was not intelligence, not technology. It was the choice the first clear generation had made in the ashes of the old world. The choice to build systems that made honesty easier than deception, rather than trying to make deception rarer through punishment. You cannot punish your way to truth. The library proved that, 11 times over. You can only build structures where truth is the path of least resistance. This became the foundational philosophy of what historians would call the long project, humanity's multi-generational effort to become worthy of the Accord. Year 200, the human population had grown to 9 billion, distributed across Earth in a growing network of off-world settlements. Mars, the asteroid belt, 3 orbital habitats, and the first permanent structure on Titan. The mesh had evolved over generations into something far more sophisticated than its founders had imagined. Not a government, not a market, something new. A living, self-correcting system of mutual accountability in which every settlement maintained its sovereignty. Every individual maintained their voice, and the whole was held together by the shared commitment to transparency that had become, over generations, not just a political choice, but a cultural identity. Humans were the transparent species. That was who they were now. Visitors from the Accord. Because yes, by year 180, the Valthari had begun allowing limited cultural exchange visits, consistently expressed something that translated roughly as bewilderment. Not because humanity's technology was impressive, though it was. Not because their culture was rich, Tugid was, because of the ledger. Every species in the Accord maintained transparency in their governance systems. It was required for membership, but none of them had made it a cultural art form the way humans had. The Accord species were transparent because the rules required it. Humans were transparent because they had learned, through fire and loss, and 400 million deaths and the bones of 11 failed civilizations. That deception was a poison that killed slowly and completely. They were transparent the way a person who is nearly drowned is careful around water. Not from rules. From memory. The Valthari exchanged liaison, called Varath, who had been assigned to the human Mish for 40 years, wrote in a report to the Accord. I have observed 17 species in my career. Humanity is the only one that appears to have developed an emotional relationship with the truth. They do not merely practice transparency. They love it. They grieve when they fail it. They celebrate when they uphold it. This is not compliance. This is character. Year 280. The long project had reached its most ambitious phase. 4 generations. Human philosophers and engineers had been working on what they called the proof, a comprehensive demonstration, intended for the Accord's assessment at the 500-year mark of humanity's civilizational integrity. Not a performance. Not a presentation. An open invitation for the Accord to examine anything they wanted, anywhere, at any time, without notice, without preparation, without the ability for humanity to hide anything. The proof was not a document. It was a stance. Come, look at anything. We have nothing to hide, because we have built systems that make hiding structurally impossible. Verify that for yourself. Getting every settlement in the mesh to agree to this stance took 40 years of debate. It was the longest, most contentious discussion in post-sobering human history. Some settlements argued it was naive. Some argued it was dangerous. What if the Accord found something and used it against humanity? The debate was itself a perfect demonstration of the thing being debated. Every argument was logged. Every fear was acknowledged. Every dissenting settlement's concerns were addressed directly and on the record. In the end, the vote was not unanimous. It never was in the mesh, but it was sufficient. 83% of settlements in favor, with the dissenting settlements' objections formally recorded and incorporated into the proof itself as evidence of the system's genuine tolerance for internal disagreement, because that too was a form of honesty. Admitting that humanity did not always agree, and showing that the system survived disagreement without collapsing into violence. Like and subscribe. We're approaching the moment everything changes. Share this with someone who needs hope. Year 340. A crisis. Not from outside. From within. A cluster of settlements in the Eastern Pacific Mesh had, over the course of 60 years, developed a subtle but systemic distortion in their ledger reporting. Not outright lies, nothing so crude, but a consistent pattern of framing the way resource requests were categorized. The way population data was aggregated, that had the cumulative effect of directing a slightly disproportionate share of inter-settlement resources toward their cluster. No individual entry was false. The pattern itself was the deception. It was discovered by a 15-year-old in a northern Canadian settlement who was doing a school project on historical resource distribution patterns. She published her findings on the mesh. Within a week, every analyst in the human network had confirmed her methodology. Within a month, the Pacific Cluster settlements had been formally flagged under the Compact Integrity Protocols. What followed was not a war, not a punishment. A process. The Pacific Cluster settlements were given full access to the analysis that had flagged them. They were given time to respond. Their representatives were invited to a formal reconciliation forum that was broadcast openly across the entire mesh. The forum lasted 8 months. What emerged from it was not condemnation, it was understanding. The pattern had developed not from malicious intent, but from a decades-long cultural drift, a slow, generational erosion of the vigilance that transparency required. The settlements had not chosen to deceive. They had simply stopped choosing not to. That distinction mattered enormously. The resolution required the Pacific Cluster settlements to submit to 5 years of external ledger auditing, to publicly document how the drift had occurred, and to develop and publish a remediation protocol that could be adopted by any settlement that detected similar early warning signs in itself. They did all of it. The protocol they developed became one of the most widely adopted tools in the mesh. Historians would later identify the Pacific Cluster crisis as the moment when humanity demonstrated something the 11 failed species had never managed: self-correction without collapse, the ability to find the rot in the system, name it honestly, address it openly, and emerge stronger without fracturing. The Valthari liaison filed another report to the Accord. The organism has shown immune function. Notable: year 410, 60 years from the assessment. Windows close. The Accord sent a delegation, not the Valthari alone this time. 11 species. Representatives from every member of the Accord that had sent observers to the human assessment. They arrived in a vessel unlike anything humanity had seen, not a single ship but a formation of 11 vessels. Each one different in design. Each one representing the aesthetic and technological tradition of a different species. They requested a meeting with whatever humanity considered its central authority. The answer they received was simultaneously the simplest and most complex response in diplomatic history. We have no central authority. We have a mesh. You are welcome to meet with any part of it, all of it, or to examine the structure itself. We recommend the structure. The delegation chose the structure. For 3 years, 11 alien species examined the human mesh in exhaustive detail. They attended settlement councils. They reviewed ledger records going back for centuries. They interviewed individuals from every demographic, every region, every generation. They read the full record of the Pacific Cluster crisis. They studied the library of 11 analysis. They traced the evolution from the first honest charter through every iteration and refinement that had brought the mesh to its current form. They were given access to the proof. And they looked at everything. Like, share, and subscribe. 60 years left in the assessment. Don't stop now, year 423. The delegation had one more request. They wanted to speak with humanity, not with a representative, not with a selected speaker, but with the mesh itself. They wanted to ask a question and have every settlement answer it independently, without coordination, without preparation. The question was transmitted simultaneously to every settlement in the human network. On Earth and off-world, from the inner solar system settlements to the furthest habitats near the orbit of Neptune, the question was, what did you lose in the sobering that you do not want back? The answers came in over 72 hours. Tens of thousands of settlements, hundreds of millions of individual responses, aggregated by their settlement standard protocols. The delegation read every one. The answers were not identical. They were never identical in the mesh. That was the point. But there was a pattern in them. Not in the content exactly, but in the shape of the answers. Almost no settlement mourned the loss of comfort. Almost no settlement mourned the loss of security. What settlements mourned, if they mourned anything, was the loss of innocence. The ability to not know, to be shielded from complexity. to hand the difficult decisions to someone else and trust that it would be handled. The sobering had ended that. Permanently, and almost universally, having mourned it, the settlements concluded. We do not want it back. Comfort, purchased with ignorance, is not comfort. It is anesthesia. The delegation conferred for 6 months after receiving the answers. Then they sent a message to the human mesh. The Accord will reconvene its full assembly in 14 months to consider the question of humanity's candidacy. We do not make a recommendation at this time. We observe that the answer to our question, in its diversity and its consensus, is itself an answer to the larger question we were sent to evaluate. We observe further that humanity appears to understand what it is, what it was, and the difference between them. This is rare. 14 months. Humanity waited. Not quietly. The mesh was never quiet. There was debate and planning and anxiety and excitement and disagreement and everything that had characterized human civilization since the first clear generation had stitched it back together from the wreckage of the old world. But underneath all of it, something that had not existed in the frantic, frightened days of the old world. Groundedness. The certainty that whatever the Accord decided, humanity knew who it was. The sobering had stripped away the illusions. The 423 years since had been spent building something real, not perfect. The mesh was not perfect. Human beings were not perfect, but real, honest. Theirs, year 424. The Accord Assembly convened. The human mesh received a final transmission from the delegation before the assembly began. It was from Myreth, the Valthari liaison, who had spent 40 years among humans a century and a half earlier. Now ancient by human reckoning, now communicating through a descendant who served as interpreter. Myreth sent a personal message outside of official channels. It was 3 words in the Valthari language, and the translation had been debated by linguists for the week it took to reach the mesh. The consensus translation was, "We see you. Not we approve of you. Not you have passed. We see you." In the Valthari cultural context, as far as human scholars had decoded it, to be truly seen by another person or people was the deepest possible form of acknowledgement, not judgment, not evaluation, recognition of genuine existence. The Valthari, who had watched humanity for 12,000 years, through 7 civilizational cycles, through the collapse and the long rebuilding, through the library and the ledger and the Pacific crisis and the proof, were saying, "We see you." Whatever the assembly decided, that would not change. Like and subscribe and share this video. Humanity is about to hear the verdict. Don't look away now. The assembly took 11 days. On the 12th day, the transmission arrived. It was long, longer than any previous Accord communication with humanity. It took 6 hours to transmit and 3 days to fully decode. When the decoding was complete, every settlement in the mesh received the full text simultaneously. The first section was technical, a formal assessment of humanity's governance structures, resource management systems, conflict resolution protocols, educational frameworks, and intersettlement compact integrity. 60 pages of rigorous evaluation, clinical in its precision, exhaustive in its scope. The assessment concluded that humanity's governance architecture represented a novel and functional model not previously observed in Accord history. The second section was historical, the Accord's analysis of humanity's civilizational arc from the sobering to the present, set in the context of the 11 failed species and the broader pattern the Accord had observed across its thousands of years of monitoring planetary civilizations. This section concluded that humanity's recovery trajectory was statistically anomalous, that no species in Accord records had sustained a self-correction of this scale without external governance. Imposition. The mesh had not been built by the Accord. It had been built by humans, for humans, from the wreckage of a system that had failed them. That, the assessment noted, was the relevant fact. The third section was the verdict. It was a single paragraph. The Accord of Spacefaring Peoples, convened in its 417th full assembly, finds that the species known as humanity of the third planet of the Sol system is demonstrated, over a period of 424 years following civilizational intervention, the essential quality required for membership in the Accord, the sustained collective will to see clearly, speak honestly, and build accordingly, without external compulsion, in the face of continuous difficulty. The Accord extends to humanity an invitation to begin the candidacy process. The invitation carries no conditions beyond those humanity has already imposed on itself. We find those conditions sufficient. The message ended there. The mesh was silent for 11 seconds. 11 seconds, across all of Earth, across Mars, across the asteroid settlements, across Titan and the orbital habitats, and the deep space relay stations. No one transmitted anything. Then, all at once, everything. Not a coordinated celebration. Not a broadcast from a central authority declaring victory. Millions of individual settlements, each in its own way, each in its own language, each with its own specific texture of joy and relief and grief for those who had not lived to see it. Because there was grief, too, in the celebration. 400 million people who had died in the year of glass. The 40 million of the long scatter. The generations who had lived their whole lives in the difficult middle years, who had built and sacrificed and held the line without knowing if it would ever mean anything. They were in the celebration, too. Their names were in the ledger. Every settlement kept historical records, and every record was accessible on the mesh. And in the hours after the verdict, people across the solar system went to those records, not just to celebrate, to remember, to say the names, because that too was transparency. That too was honesty. You do not get to stand in the light and forget the people who carried torches in the dark. Year 424. Day 47 after the verdict, the first formal meeting between a human delegation and the full Accord. The delegation was not chosen by election. There was no election in the mesh, no central authority to appoint anyone. The delegation was chosen the way all major decisions were made, by open candidacy, open discussion, transparent voting across every settlement, with the results and the reasoning fully recorded. It was 11 humans, one for each species in the Accord. A symbolic choice that the mesh had debated extensively and ultimately found fitting. 11 humans from 11 different settlements, from 11 different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, representing a civilization that had nearly destroyed itself and had instead rebuilt into something the universe had never seen before. They entered the Accord chamber in a vessel built by human hands, flying on human fusion technology, bearing the open eye symbol that had started as the emblem of a small movement in the ruins of a broken world. The Accord's presiding representative, a being whose species had been spacefaring for 60,000 years, greeted them and translated Standard, the composite language the Accord used for interspecies communication. "You are late," the representative said. The lead human delegate, a woman named Kimamanda Asabansu, a historian from a West African mesh settlement, smiled. "We had to learn how to see first," she said. The representative's expression, as best as the human translators could read it, suggested something like appreciation. "That," the representative said, "is the correct answer. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Share it with everyone you know. Humanity made it in the years that followed. Humanity's integration into the Accord was careful, gradual, and managed with the same transparent deliberateness that had characterized everything since the first clear generation. There was no sudden flood of alien technology, no immediate access to the full breadth of Accord knowledge and resources. The candidacy process, as the Accord had structured it over millennia of experience with new species, was designed to be slow, not punitive, protective of both parties. The Accord had learned, over thousands of years, that the most dangerous moment for any new member species was the first rush of contact with the wider universe. The access to resources and technologies and perspectives so far beyond anything a single planet species had experienced could be destabilizing in ways that undid everything the assessment process was designed to ensure. So the candidacy process moved deliberately. Human mesh settlements studied Accord governance structures and contributed their own innovations to the ongoing conversation about how spacefaring civilizations could organize themselves. The mesh's transparency protocols, turned out, were of significant interest to several older Accord species that had long struggled with internal corruption in their own governance systems. The species that had been watched for 12,000 years and had nearly been destroyed by its own deceptions. It was within a generation of joining the candidacy process, offering lessons in honesty to civilizations that had been spacefaring before humanity's ancestors had learned to farm. There is no outcome the Valthari could have predicted for the species they had sobered 400 years earlier. There is no outcome the 11 failed species, if any of them had survived to see it, would have believed possible. There is no version of the old world with its comfortable lies and its manufactured securities, and its careful management of what people were allowed to know that could have gotten humanity here. Only the truth had been strong enough to carry them. Only the hard years, the years of loss and fracture and grief and stubborn rebuilding, had been enough. Only the choice, made by generation after generation in the long, quiet middle of the long project, to keep building honestly even when no one was watching and no reward was promised, only that had been enough. The universe is vast. It is full of species that chose the easy path. Their libraries are in orbit around Mars. Humanity chose differently, not because humans were better, not because they were smarter or braver or more deserving, because enough of them, in enough of the dark years, held on to the belief that a real thing, honestly built, was worth more than a beautiful thing, carefully constructed to hide an empty core. They were right. The universe agreed, and somewhere in the long archived records of the Valthari, in the 12,000-year file they had kept on the species of the third planet of the Sol system, a notation was added on the day humanity accepted its candidacy invitation. It was brief. In the Valthari language, it translated roughly as, "They found it. They had been watching for 12,000 years for humanity to find the thing that would save it. Not technology, not military strength, not political genius. Honesty. The willingness to see clearly, to speak truly, and to build accordingly, even when it cost everything. Especially when it costs everything, they found Italiano." Subscribe, like, and share this saga. If humanity could survive 470 years of peace, you can survive anything. This is HFY. The candidacy process lasted 40 years. 40 years of the most careful, methodical, transparent exchange of knowledge in human history. The Accord did not dump its accumulated wisdom on humanity all at once. It offered it in layers, each layer contingent on demonstrated understanding of the last, not as a test of intelligence. The Accord had long stopped caring about raw intelligence. Every species that had ever failed had been intelligent. Intelligence without honesty was just a sharper tool for building a more elaborate lie. What the Accord tested, in its slow layered way, was integration. Could humanity absorb new knowledge without losing itself in it? Could the mesh process information that challenged its foundational assumptions and come out the other side? Still the mesh. The first layer was astronomical. The true map of the galaxy, including the locations of every known spacefaring species, every dead civilization, every monitored pre-contact world. There were more than humanity had imagined. 67 spacefaring species currently active in the Accord. 214 monitored pre-contact worlds, each one in its own assessment window, and 11,409 dead civilizations in the Accord's historical record. 11,000. The number hit the mesh like a physical force. The library of 11 in Mars orbit, which humanity had spent 200 years studying, had been a sample. A tiny, carefully chosen sample. The full graveyard of galactic history was 11,000 species wide. Humanity had always known the universe was vast. They had not known it was quite so full of failure. Like and subscribe. The full scale of what humanity survived is about to hit you. The philosophical weight of that number reshaped human culture in ways that took generations to fully manifest. Children born during the candidacy years grew up understanding their civilization, not as a recovery story, but as a statistical miracle. They were not special because they were human. They were rare because they had chosen, over and over and over across 400 years, to do the difficult thing. And the difficult thing, it turned it out, was not what the old world had imagined. The old world had thought the difficult thing was strength. Military strength, economic dominance, technological supremacy. The actual difficult thing was simpler and harder than any of those. The actual difficult thing was looking at what was real and refusing to look away from it. For 460 years, enough humans had done that. That was why they were here. The second layer of Accord knowledge was biological. The Accord's accumulated understanding of life in the universe, spanning 60,000 years of observation and research. Life was common. Far more common than old Earth scientists had estimated. But complex life. Life that developed tools, language, culture. The capacity for a civilizational organization was rarer. And civilizational life that survived long enough to reach space was rarer still. And civilizational life that survived long enough to reach space and then chose honesty over convenience was so rare that humanity's entire candidacy file had been flagged as anomalous by the Accord's assessment algorithms. The algorithm had initially returned an error, not because humanity's data was corrupted, because humanity's trajectory didn't match any of the 11,000 precedent files. The Accord had needed to create a new category. They called it emergent integrity, a classification for species that developed systemic honesty not through external imposition but through internal catastrophe and self-correction. Humanity was the first species ever placed in that category. They would not be the last, because one of the secondary effects of humanity joining the candidacy process was the decision debated across the mesh for 15 years, with every argument logged and every settlement vote recorded to make their full history available to the Accord's pre-contact monitoring program. Not as a template, not as a prescription. As a data point, as evidence that it was possible, that a species could fall as far as humanity had fallen in the Year of Glass and still climb back. That the sobering didn't have to be a death sentence. That honesty, chosen freely and built into systems carefully, was a survivable path. The Accord's pre-contact teams began, with great care and no intervention, studying how to factor humanity's example into their long-term monitoring models. It would take centuries to see whether it changed any outcomes. But the data point existed now. Humanity had not just survived. Humanity had become evidence. Subscribe and share. Humanity just changed the fate of other worlds without even trying. Year 406. Humanity's candidacy assessment entered its final phase. The last requirement of the candidacy process was not a test that the Accord administered. It was a question that the candidate species had to answer for itself. The question was, what do you want from the Accord? Not what do you offer. Not what do you need. What do you want? The distinction mattered to the Accord because the answer revealed the character of a species' ambitions. Species that answered with resource acquisition, territorial expansion, or technological access were assessed differently than species that answered otherwise. The mesh spent 3 years on the question. Every settlement, every demographic, every generation from the children of the candidacy years to the elders who had been born in the long scatter and had lived long enough in the extended lifespans that honest healthcare had produced. To see this moment, the debate was the longest and richest in mesh history, and when it was done, when every settlement had voted and every vote had been tallied and logged and the synthesis had been assembled by the most sophisticated deliberative algorithm the mesh had ever produced, the answer was ready. It was not short. It was not simple. It ran to 40 pages, because 40 pages was what was needed to say it honestly. But its score, distilled to its essence by the summary protocol, was 3 sentences. We want to be useful to the project of keeping life alive in the universe. We want to learn everything we do not yet understand. We want to never again be the species that needed someone else to force it awake. The Accord Assembly received the answer. They deliberated for 4 days. On the 5th day, they responded. The answer is accepted. Humanity's candidacy process is complete. Welcome to the Accord. Like this video, subscribe, share. Humanity just joined the stars. The day the full membership transmission arrived was later named Foundation Day. Not Independence Day. Not Victory Day. Foundation Day. Because that was what the mesh understood it to be. Not an ending. Not a reward. A foundation. The beginning of whatever came next. There were celebrations, of course. In every settlement on Earth, on Mars, in the asteroid belt, on Titan, in the orbital habitats drifting at the edge of the inner solar system. But the celebrations had a quality that outside observers, including the Accord liaisons who were present in many of the larger settlements for the occasion, found difficult to describe in their reports. One Accord liaison, from a species that had been spacefaring for 30,000 years, and had attended membership ceremonies for 14 other species, wrote in her official report, "Human celebrations of significant events appear to contain grief as a structural element rather than as an intrusion. They do not celebrate despite their losses. They celebrate. With them, the names of the dead are spoken in the same breath as the names of the living. I have not observed this in any other species. I do not have a framework for it. I am noting it because it seems important. It was important. It was perhaps the most important thing about humanity that the Accord would take centuries to fully understand. The humans who danced on Foundation Day were dancing with the 212 million dead of the Year of Glass, with the 40 million of the Long Scatter, with every generation that had held the mesh together through the hard middle years without knowing whether it would ever mean anything. The dead were not behind them. The dead were in the dance. That was what honesty looked like when it reached all the way down. Not just transparency and governance, not just accuracy in records. The refusal to pretend that the cost had not been paid. The insistence on remembering who had paid it. Year 470. 46 years after Foundation Day. The generation now leading the mesh had been born after the candidacy process, after Foundation Day, into a world where humanity's place in the Accord was simply a fact of life. They took it for granted the way every generation takes for granted the world their parents and grandparents built. That was right and natural. You are not supposed to carry the full weight of history every moment of your life. You are supposed to receive the world you inherit and then add to it. This generation was adding to it. The Accord's knowledge, now flowing to humanity through the established candidacy channels, had accelerated human scientific progress in ways that were difficult to overstate. Not because the Accord had handed over finished technologies. Because the Accord's accumulated knowledge of what was and wasn't physically possible had allowed human researchers to stop pursuing dead ends. 400 years of open-source research, freed from the profit motive that had once strangled scientific progress, had produced a human scientific culture of extraordinary creativity and rigor. That culture, now pointed at the Accord's broader map of what was possible, was producing results that surprised even the Accord's oldest member species. In the field of gravitational engineering, human researchers, in a collaborative compact spanning 47 settlements, proposed a theoretical framework that 3 senior Accord scientists initially dismissed as impossible. Within 6 years, a prototype had been built and tested in the asteroid belt. It worked. The Accord's senior physicists asked to see the methodology. The humans sent a full research record. Every dead end, every failed test, every argument among the research team, every revision to the theory, every piece of raw data from every experiment. 11,000 pages of transparent process. The Accord physicists spent 2 years going through it. Their conclusion was not that humanity had discovered something new. Their conclusion was that humanity's research methodology itself was the discovery, the transparent process, the requirement built into the mesh's research compact protocols, that all research be conducted with full documentation of failures as well as successes, with all data publicly accessible, with all arguments among researchers recorded and preserved, had produced a quality of scientific work that the Accord had not seen before. Because in the Accord, even in the most advanced species, there was always some incentive to hide failure. Status, reputation, resources. The human mesh had built those incentives out of the research process. Failure was not a source of shame. It was a source of data. And data was everything. Subscribe and like. Humanity is now teaching the oldest civilizations in the galaxy. The Accord requested a formal presentation on human research methodology. The mesh debated how to respond. Some settlements wanted to give a presentation. Some wanted to simply open the full archive. They did both. A team of 12 researchers from across the mesh presented the methodology to a full Accord assembly, and then they opened the complete archive of 400 years of post-sobering human research to the Accord's shared knowledge network. Every study, every dataset, every failure log, every revision. For centuries of humanity learning how to learn, the Accord's response was unprecedented in its institutional history. 7 member species formally requested to send exchange scholars to human settlements. Not to teach, to study. The species that had nearly destroyed itself with its own deceptions was now hosting scholars from civilizations 60,000 years its senior, coming to learn how to be honest about what they didn't know. The irony was not lost on the humans. They logged Italiano, of course, they logged it. Year 470, day 112, a child was born in a mesh settlement on the eastern coast of what had once been called Australia. Her name was Yara. She would grow up knowing the Accord, the way her ancestors had grown up knowing nation-states. As a fact of the world's structure, incomprehensible to live inside of, taken for granted until you stopped and looked at it. She would grow up with access to the educational resources of 67 spacefaring civilizations. She would grow up knowing the names of 11,000 dead worlds and the story of each one's failure. She would grow up knowing the story of the Year of Glass and the Long Scatter and the First Clear Generation and the Pacific Cluster Crisis and Foundation Day. She would grow up knowing that the world she was born into had been paid for in 470 years of suffering and stubbornness and small daily choices made by millions of people who would never be famous, whose names were in the ledger but would never be spoken at ceremonies, who had simply held on and kept building and refused to lie when lying would have been easier. She would understand, as children raised in the mesh always understood, that this world was not a gift from the universe. It was a gift from those people. And someday, when she was old enough to take her place in whatever part of the mesh called to her, she would add her own small piece to it, log her own work, record her own reasoning, acknowledge her own mistakes, hold the line the same way they had held it, not for the Accord, not for history, for the simple, radical, ancient, hard-won reason that a real thing honestly built is worth more than anything else in the universe. That was what the sobering had cost. That was what the 470 years had bought. A world where a child named Yara could be born knowing, without being told, without having to earn it through suffering, what her species had learned the hard and beautiful and devastating way. The truth sets you free. But first it takes everything you thought you were, and what you build after, if you are willing to build it honestly, is something the universe will come to see. Something it will, in its oldest and most deliberate voice, recognize. Something it will call, finally, worthy. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, share Saga, because humanity held on, and so can you HFY forever.